Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 42 minutes before his entire world collapsed. He didn't know who he was talking to. He had no idea what stood in front of him wearing blue scrubs and a hospital badge that read N. Hayes, RN. Cedar Creek Medical in Portland smells like antiseptic and floor wax, laid under something older, the ghost of every person who has died here in the last 30 years. Natalie Hayes moves through these corridors at 5:02 a.m., 30 minutes before her shift officially begins, touching the worn combat boots in her locker the way some people touch rosaries. Helmand Province, 2015. She was a different rank then. A different name on different paperwork. The boots still have sand in the laces from forward operating base shank. She leaves them here because bringing them home would mean explaining them. 6 months ago, Naval Intelligence placed her at Cedar Creek with a single objective: determine who is selling patient information to foreign actors. The assignment came with medical credentials, a carefully constructed civilian employment history, and a patient list containing exactly one name that mattered. Admiral James Carson, decorated officer, recovering in the cardiac wing after emergency bypass surgery, still carrying enough classified knowledge in his head to warrant a protective detail if anyone knew he needed one. The problem was nobody could know. A military guard would announce his presence. A security detail would raise questions. So they sent her instead. Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, who had spent 12 years in the Navy Nursing Corps before JSOC borrowed her for field work, now working trauma rotation under a civilian name, monitoring a man whose right arm bore a tattoo that read simply Hayes, a name from a firefight in San Juan Valley that he barely remembered and she could never forget. The night shift nurse, Claire, is pulling out of the parking lot when Natalie arrives. Claire waves from her sedan, exhausted, ready to forget this place until next Tuesday. Natalie waved back with her left hand, her right hand gripping her badge. The limp in her left leg is real, a 7.62 round through the quadriceps in 2013 that healed but never quite straightened. She minimizes it during rounds. Most people don't notice. The ones who do usually think she had a car accident or maybe a fall. Nobody thinks combat. The hospital wakes up slowly. By 6:30, the fluorescent lights have fully hummed to life, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional gray that makes even healthy people look sick. Natalie starts her rounds in the cardiac wing, checking post-op patients, monitoring vitals, documenting everything in the system with the precision of someone trained to keep people alive under fire. Most of the patients barely register her presence. She is competent and quiet. Invisible. This is intentional. Admiral Carson is awake when she reaches his room. He's in his mid-60s, the kind of fit that comes from a lifetime of discipline, with silver threading through his dark hair and a face that has given orders to people with guns. He shouldn't be conscious yet. The anesthesia should keep him under for another hour. His eyes track her as she enters, and for a moment, just a moment, something flickers across his expression. Recognition without recognition. A ghost of a memory he cannot quite access. Natalie checks his EKG monitor, documents his heart rate at 72 beats per minute, normal sinus rhythm post-operatively. She does not meet his eyes. The proximity is already dangerous. If he remembers, everything collapses. If she shows any sign that she remembers, everything collapses. She adjusts his fore and leaves the room having spoken exactly 0 words, which is more than she usually manages. Dr. Whitfield is waiting at the nurse's station when she returns from Admiral Carson's room. His tall, expensively dressed even in hospital scrubs, designer watch, shoes that cost more than Natalie makes in a week, and he has the particular confidence of a man who has never been told no by someone who could make it stick. He's been watching her for the last 2 weeks, noting how she questions equipment orders, how she asks about patient billing charges, how she pulls supply manifests and compares them against actual inventory. He's built a lucrative network of kickbacks from 3 different medical supply companies, inflating equipment costs by 30% and pocketing the difference. $300,000 per quarter. He's not about to let a cautious new nurse with a habit of asking questions interfere with that arrangement. Natalie, he says, and the way he says her name makes it clear he doesn't respect it. You've been pulling a lot of reports lately. Just trying to understand the department workflow, she says, keeping her voice soft, her shoulders slightly forward. Deferential. The mask of a nurse who is trying not to make waves. Equipment ordering is above your pay grade, Whitfield says. Your job is patient care, not auditing. Of course, doctor. My apologies. She's already moving, already leaving, but she's heard what she needed to hear. His defensiveness confirms the pattern. The equipment orders are the vulnerability. Whatever is happening, kickback scheme, price inflation, insurance fraud, it starts in procurement. But that's not the worst part. By 11:30, Natalie is sitting in the hospital cafeteria with a tray of salad and coffee, the only meal she allows herself during 12-hour shifts. The room is loud with the particular chaos of a hospital at lunch rush, doctors, nurses, administrators, maintenance staff, all occupying the same space with varying degrees of actual hunger. She sits in a corner, watching the room, a habit that dies hard in people who have lived in places where inattention can be fatal. Dr. Whitfield enters with two attending physicians, men named Sterling and Bennett, both of whom have been at Cedar Creek long enough to benefit from Whitfield's generous supply chain, consulting fees. They sit 3 tables away, loud enough for her to hear, loud enough for the cafeteria to hear. New nurse on trauma rotation, Whitfield says, his voice pitched for maximum carry. Quiet little thing. Smart, though. Too smart. I'm betting she quits within a week. How much? Sterling asks. $500. She's going to realize this place runs on compromise, that there's a certain way things are done, and she won't have the stomach for it. Nobody has explicitly asked her about the equipment orders again. But the message is clear. Natalie keeps eating her salad, her hand steady, her expression unchanged. The coffee tastes like copper. This is what happens when you maintain your composure long enough, your body stops trusting that safety is possible. She's almost finished when Whitfield walks past her table. Almost finished, which means her lunch tray is still in front of her, still there when he accidentally knocks it to the floor. The tray doesn't fall gracefully. It shatters. The salad container bursts open across the tile in an explosion of lettuce and dressing and plastic, and the coffee cup cracks but doesn't break, spilling a dark river across 3 feet of floor space. The room goes quiet. That particular silence that happens in public spaces when someone has just crossed a line and everyone is waiting to see how the crossed against will respond. Natalie looks at her lap, where a single piece of lettuce has landed. She looks at the floor. She does not look at Whitfield, and her face does not change. She is not trembling. She is not embarrassed. She is not angry. She is standing up, reaching for paper towels, beginning to clean up the mess while 47 people in the cafeteria watch and say nothing. Clumsy, Whitfield says, loud enough for the room to hear. You should probably just. Excuse me, doctor, she says, her voice exactly level, and then she grabs a patient chart from a nearby table, a real one, someone's actual medical record, and throws it at her feet. Her hands are steady. Her breathing is steady. Her eyes are flat and cold in a way that makes 3 nearby doctors suddenly very interested in their sandwiches. She bends down and picks up the chart. She throws away the paper towels with the food. She walks back to the trauma unit without another word, and the room stays silent for exactly 7 seconds after she leaves, which is how long it takes for everyone to realize they have just witnessed something that looked like submission and tasted like a threat. That night, Natalie sits in her apartment with her laptop open to meaningless spreadsheets, the kind that a civilian nurse would spend time on, and her hands on the combat boots from Helmand Province. She lifts them sometimes, feels the weight of sand from a decade ago, remembers the firefight in Sanjin Valley where a young Navy corpsman with her name on his arm got shot and kept running anyway. She was 26 years old. He was 23. They were in a compound that shouldn't have existed, conducting operations that were never officially authorized, and he bled on her uniform for 3 miles before they reached the extraction point. She touches the scars on her forearms where shrapnel took pieces of her skin in 2013. She sits in the dark of her apartment with boots that smell like dust and sweat from a life she is supposed to have left behind, and she wonders if maintaining her cover is worth the daily degradation of being called sweetheart by a man who is embezzling from sick people. Her phone buzzes. A text from an unlisted number, Admiral's vitals nominal. You're clear to proceed with investigation. She puts the phone down. She picks up the boots. She sits there in the darkness, holding the only evidence that she was ever anything other than Natalie Hayes, nurse, watching the city lights blur through her apartment window like distant fires she can no longer reach. 3 days later, the monitors screamed. Admiral Carson was in the cardiac wing, routine examination, when the alarms began their frantic percussion against the morning quiet. Natalie was 2 floors down, charting in the burn unit, when she heard it, not the alarm itself, but the quality of silence that followed, the particular absence of sound that meant something catastrophic had shifted in the hospital's rhythm. She knew that silence. She'd heard it in Helmand Province, in the seconds after incoming round stopped and you realized someone wasn't getting up. She moved before conscious thought caught up with her feet. By the time she reached the cardiac wing, the crash cart was already rolling, but the movement around it was wrong, scattered, reactive, like startled birds. Dr. Whitfield barked orders that contradicted each other. Push epi, hold the epi, get me a 12 lead, what's the rhythm, nobody move. 2 nurses froze mid-motion. The attending physician stood with his hands half raised, waiting for clarification that wasn't coming. The monitor displayed what Natalie's eyes had already told her, massive pulmonary embolism, the kind that stopped hearts mid-breath. Clot the size of a fist lodged in the wrong place. Step back, Natalie said. Not a request. Her voice had dropped an octave without her permission. Whitfield spun on her. This is a physician-led code, nurse. Stand down. Admiral Carson's lips were already turning blue. The O2 sat was dropping in real time, 92, 88, 84, and nobody in this room had the muscle memory that mattered. Natalie didn't argue. She grabbed a scalpel from the crash cart, fingers steady as surgical steel, and opened his chest with 3 precise incisions, skin, fascia, rib spread with a rib spreader that hissed against resistance. The sound of her own breathing was absent. She'd learned long ago that you could do extraordinary things if you pretended your body didn't belong to you. The pericardium opened. His heart lay exposed, pale as a fish, barely moving at all. You're not authorized, Whitfield started. Natalie's bare hand entered his chest cavity. She was aware of gasps, of someone saying Jesus Christ, of Whitfield's voice reaching for authority it no longer held. Pain was information. The Admiral's heart was ice under her fingers, no perfusion, no rhythm worth measuring. She began direct cardiac massage, her hand working against his ventricle with the precise, practiced compression she'd learned in a dust storm outside Kandahar, her arm pumping like she was trying to restart something the world needed alive. Her hands moved on their own. Her mind was somewhere else entirely, watching from above, noting the exact pressure her fingers applied, the angle of approach, the fraction of a second the heart needed to remember how to beat. She'd done this before, saved a lance corporal named Patterson who'd taken shrapnel in the femoral. Saved a Sergeant Martinez when his brain started swelling from a mortar concussion. Saved lives in ways that left no paperwork trail, no official record, just a name whispered in military hospitals, the devil woman who could restart the dead. The Admiral's heart contracted under her hand. Once. Twice. A tremor became a pulse, became a rhythm. O2 sat climbed, 74, 81, 89, 94. Sinus rhythm returned like a miracle nobody had the right to expect. The entire hospital staff watched through the observation window, nurses, residents, a chaplain, a housekeeper who'd paused mid-sweep, as Natalie Hayes, 6-month trauma nurse, did something that the textbook said wasn't possible. She stepped back. Her hand was dripping. Someone was crying. It wasn't her. Within 1 hour, Whitfield had made 3 phone calls to board members, activated favors from hospital administrators, and contacted her nursing school in Virginia demanding a full background check. By lunch, a compliance officer was waiting in her locker room with a manila folder and her expression like someone about to defuse a bomb. There are questions about your credentials, the officer said. Natalie was still wearing scrubs stained with Admiral Carson's blood. She hadn't showered. Hadn't sat down. She'd simply continued her rounds as though she'd performed a routine procedure instead of field trauma surgery in the cardiac wing. What questions? Her voice was steady. Completely flat. Your nursing school transcripts show no gaps, no summer sessions off, perfect grades across the board. That's statistically unusual. That was because the transcripts were forged by Naval Intelligence's Documents Division, and they'd never leave a thread loose. But Natalie said nothing. She waited. That was the thing about being undercover, you learned that silence was a weapon sharper than argument. We need to verify your references personally, the officer continued. And there's an internal investigation into whether you exceeded your scope of practice during this morning's code. Admiral Carson was in cardiac arrest. His heart had stopped. Physicians don't typically perform open chest massage in a hospital setting. There are protocols. His heart wasn't beating. Natalie's voice hadn't changed. It is now. That's the protocol I follow. That evening, Whitfield appeared in her apartment. Not broke in, he had her address from her hire paperwork, had maybe called ahead to some building manager. He stood in her living room like he owned it, wearing a smile that looked like something you'd wear to a funeral. That was an impressive show this morning, he said. But impressive isn't the same as appropriate. You performed a surgical procedure without authorization. You operated outside the chain of command. Natalie didn't invite him to sit. Didn't offer coffee. She understood the visit's purpose perfectly, it was a threat dressed up as conversation. The Admiral survived, she said. The Admiral survived, and you've drawn the kind of attention that complicates my work here. See, I have certain arrangements with certain pharmaceutical companies, certain agreements about equipment procurement that require a particular level of discretion. You asked questions about those arrangements. You noticed discrepancies that nobody else was supposed to notice. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. And now you've made yourself a hospital hero, which means you can't disappear quietly. So here's what's going to happen, you're going to keep your mouth shut about everything you've seen. You're going to forget about those medication discrepancies. And if you try to defend yourself, if you try to explain what happened in that code, you blow your cover. He knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew. Naval Intelligence will pull you from this assignment, he continued. Mission failure. Which means you spend the next decade explaining to the Pentagon why you compromised a deep cover operation because you wanted to tell some story about saving an admiral. That the kind of thing a Master Chief Petty Officer wants on her service record. He smiled wider. I thought not. By evening, her security badge had been deactivated. Her locker was empty, contents boxed up and left at the security desk. She was escorted from Cedar Creek Medical by a hospital administrator who wouldn't quite meet her eyes, didn't speak, just waited at the elevator while she got in and the doors closed on the only assignment that mattered. At 3 a.m, Natalie sat in an empty diner on Powell Boulevard, rain hammering against the windows like applause from a crowd that didn't know her name. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago, a dark liquid in a white cup, reflecting nothing back at her but a hollow-eyed reflection she almost didn't recognize. She'd saved an admiral's life. She'd broken protocol and paid the price. She'd done everything a hero was supposed to do and walked out the back door alone. The combat boots were still in her car trunk, worn leather that smelled like dust from a province she'd stopped dreaming about years ago. Scars on her hands told stories nobody asked about. Her voice had changed in that code, dropped into a register she only used in the dark, and nobody had asked about that either. The rain kept falling. The diner hummed with fluorescent light and the distant murmur of the only waitress, reading a magazine behind the counter. Natalie pressed her forehead against the cold window glass and understood something she'd been avoiding for 6 months: you could save lives and lose everything. You could be a hero and still be erased. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. The next morning, the hospital opened like it always did, fluorescent lights flickering to life, coffee makers gurgling in staff lounges, the familiar percussion of rolling carts and beeping monitors filling the sterile air. Natalie wasn't there. She was supposed to be, but her badge was dark, her locker was sealed, and somewhere in the chain of command, a notation had been entered into Cedar Creek Medical's personnel database, *reassigned pending investigation. But at 6:08 a.m., a critical patient arrived in the cardiac wing that changed everything. The transfer came through Harbor Security, a 58-year-old male, dual-status detainee, federal protection order in place. Taliban field commander, code-named Ghazni, now seeking asylum under federal protection and critical care medical supervision. He'd been wounded in a crossfire incident 2 months prior, and his cardiac function had deteriorated to the point where only Cedar Creek's advanced cardiac unit could manage his case. The protocols were classified. The guards were armed. The room was locked down before breakfast was finished. Dr. Whitfield reviewed his chart at 7:15 a.m., his jaw tightening as he scanned the federal protection order. Federal cases meant federal oversight. Federal oversight meant reduced autonomy. No opportunity for the kind of flexible billing practices that had funded his expanded lifestyle. But a critical patient was still a billable patient. He signed off on the pre-examination workup and moved on to his rounds, already calculating the revenue ceiling. The examination was scheduled for 9 a.m. At 8:52 a.m., Natalie Hayes walked back into Cedar Creek Medical through the employee entrance on Powell Street. She was not supposed to be there. She had no badge. She had no assignment. She had no authorization from anyone in the hospital hierarchy. What she had was a classified alert on her Navy-issued encrypted phone, sent directly from the Joint Operations Center at Naval Station Newport, containing 3 words that overrode all local authority, *Master Chief Petty Officer Hayes. Deploy immediately. She walked through the break room in borrowed scrubs, a gift from a night shift nurse who didn't ask questions, past the attending station where 3 residents were debating anticoagulation thresholds, and down the corridor toward the cardiac wing. Her boots, not the combat boots she kept locked in her apartment, but standard hospital clogs, made no sound on the tile. Her presence made no impression. She was invisible again, exactly the way she needed to be. The Taliban commander was being prepped in Cardiac Bay 3 when she arrived. 2 guards stood at the door, sidearms visible, their eyes tracking every movement. The attending physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, was reviewing the cardiac catheterization protocol. A nurse was running a 12-lead EKG. The monitors displayed a heart rhythm that was barely holding together, elevated troponin, depressed ejection fraction, T-wave inversion screaming across the screen like a distress signal. Natalie moved to the supply station and began pulling equipment with the muscle memory of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Heparin bolus. Activated clotting time monitor. Nitroglycerine sublingual. Her eyes never lingered on the patient. Her movements were precise and depersonalized. She was a function, not a person. This was the work. Then the Taliban commander's eyes found her. He was lying on the examination table, pre-sedation for running, monitors connected, the machinery of American medicine surrounding him like the walls of a fortress he'd spent his adult life fighting against. His gaze traveled across the room, across the doctors and nurses and equipment, and then locked on Natalie's face. His body went rigid. His hand gripped the armrest hard enough that the attending noticed his knuckles whitening. "Sheetan," he whispered in Pashto. Not English. Not even loud. Just the word, exhaled like someone had reached into his chest and pulled his breath out. Natalie kept moving. Equipment to the cart. For line check. Vitals display calibration. "Sheetan Jean," he said again, louder now, his voice cracking with something that looked like fear and something that looked like the memory of fear. "Sheetan von. Sheetan von." The room froze. Dr. Chen looked up from the chart. The guard shifted position, hands moving toward their sidearms. The nurse who'd been running the EKG turned toward the commotion, confusion crossing her face like a weather system. Natalie did not turn around. She did not acknowledge the words. She adjusted the monitor settings with the same neutral efficiency she'd maintained for 6 months at Cedar Creek Medical. Every insult from Whitfield, every dismissal, every moment of calculated degradation, all of it was practice for this. All of it was training to survive being seen and not seen simultaneously. But the Taliban commander was not finished. He was trying to sit up, his full line pulling taut, his monitors beginning to alarm as his heart rate spiked from the adrenaline surge. Sheetan. The devil woman. From Sanjin Valley, Ghazni province, she carried wounded through ambush fire. She. All right, that's enough, Dr. Chen said, professionally neutral, preparing to administer pre-sedation medication. We need you to relax. This is a routine procedure. It was at that moment that security arrived to escort Natalie out. There were 2 of them, standard Cedar Creek protocol, nondescript uniforms, walkie-talkies on their belts. They'd been called by someone on the administrative floor the moment she'd swiped into the building using a borrowed access card. The hospital surveillance systems had flagged her movement through restricted areas. Whitfield had left standing orders. Asterisk if she returns, remove her immediately. Document everything. Call administration. Asterisk. Nurse Hayes, the first guard said, hand gesturing toward the door with a kind of false politeness that made the gesture worse. You're not scheduled for this unit. You need to come with us. She finished calibrating the monitor. Set down the equipment. Turned with the kind of movement that made the action impossible to interrupt, not fast, not defensive, just inevitably complete. Her eyes moved past the guards, across Dr. Chen's confused expression, past the Taliban commander whose face had transformed into something between terror and recognition, and locked directly on the monitors above the examination table. The EKG display showed what her hands had already sensed during the pre-exam workup. The anticoagulation levels were elevated. Not just borderline. Critically elevated. Someone had entered a bolus dose overnight that wasn't on the original chart. 12,000 units of heparin instead of the scheduled 5,000. At cardiac catheterization with those levels, any arterial puncture would bleed unchecked. Perforation risk would compound. Hemorrhage cascade would initiate. The anticoagulant dose is wrong, she said quietly. Not to the guards. Not to Dr. Chen. Just stated it, the way she'd stated facts in field trauma tents while rounds of small arms fire punched through the canvas walls. Pain is data, blood is information, vital signs don't lie. Dr. Chen's head snapped up from the chart. What? Someone entered a heparin bolus at 3:08 a.m. that isn't on the treatment protocol. The activated clotting time is severely prolonged. You proceed with catheterization at these levels, you're going to perforate an artery and watch him bleed out on the table. The words hung in the air with the weight of someone who wasn't guessing, wasn't theorizing, wasn't playing defensive. Someone who knew exactly what she was looking at because she'd spent 2 decades reading the difference between vital signs that spelled recovery and vital signs that spelled catastrophe. Dr. Chen leaned over the chart, scanning the overnight notes. Her face paled. She turned to the attending resident. Pull the heparin orders. I need the original anticoagulation protocol, the one from the Federal Protection Authorization, not this. She pointed to the amended orders with a kind of deliberate anger that comes from realizing someone had deliberately altered a patient's medications. The guards looked at each other. Security escorts aren't trained to make medical decisions. They aren't trained to countermand doctors' orders. They're trained to follow protocols, and the protocol had been clear: remove the reassigned nurse. But the protocol hadn't accounted for a patient whose cardiac status was collapsing because someone had sabotaged his medication record. Let's hold the procedure, Dr. Chen said, her voice dropping to the tone that senior physicians use when they're about to make a very difficult phone call. We need cardiothoracic to review this. And I need administration. Now. It was at that moment that Dr. Whitfield appeared in the doorway. His presence had that quality of inevitability, like a predator sensing wounded prey. He'd been on the floor. He'd heard the interruption. He'd heard Natalie's voice, the voice he'd been so confident he'd silenced, the voice that was supposed to stay silent, that was supposed to accept dismissal and humiliation and erasure without protest. His eyes moved across the room, taking inventory. The Taliban commander, terrified and trembling. Dr. Chen, protective and focused. The altered medication records, now visible on the desk. And Natalie, standing exactly where she wasn't supposed to be, having just prevented a preventable catastrophe by the simple act of speaking a truth he'd tried very hard to suppress. Nurse Hayes, Whitfield said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that comes from someone whose leverage is evaporating in real time. You were reassigned. Your badge has been deactivated. You have no authority to be in this unit, no authority to make medical assessments, and no authority to contradict treatment protocols that I have personally authorized. She turned to face him. Fully. Not deferential. Not apologetic. Not seeking permission. The anticoagulation dose is lethal at cardiac catheterization parameters, she said. Each word was a separate sentence. Each sentence was delivered with the kind of clinical precision that left no room for debate, no room for power dynamics, no room for anything except the simple, undeniable fact that she was right and the medication record was corrupted. Whitfield's jaw tightened. His hand moved toward his phone. Dr. Chen, I'm overriding this assessment. The pre-procedure labs are within acceptable parameters. We proceed with catheterization as scheduled. These concerns are the product of someone who is no longer qualified to assess this patient's care. Dr. Chen didn't move. She was a senior attending with 23 years of experience. She'd learned to read people the way Natalie had learned to read vital signs, by paying attention to the small details that most people missed. And what she was reading now was a senior physician who was actively contradicting medical evidence in real time. I'm pulling the procedure, Dr. Chen said flatly. And I'm calling the chief of cardiothoracic. The medication record has been altered without protocol authorization. That's not a clinical decision. That's a documentation error at minimum, and I need oversight. The room went dead silent. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless, colorless song. The monitors continued their percussion, beep, 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 the simple rhythm of a heart still beating, still fighting, still waiting for someone to make the right decision. The Taliban commander lay on the examination table, his full line still running, his body rigid with the recognition of something he'd thought he'd escaped in a war-torn valley 3,000 miles away. And Natalie stood motionless, her expression neutral, her voice completely level, as the entire ecosystem of Cedar Creek Medical's cardiac wing realized that something fundamental had just shifted. The guards looked at each other. No one had given them a new order. Removing her now, in this moment, while a senior attending was actively challenging a medication protocol and security was being requested, would make the hospital liable for interfering with patient care. Protocol broke down when medicine broke down. Whitfield's phone was already in his hand. She watched him calculate his remaining options, all of them shrinking, all of them closing off, all of them disappearing into the gravity well of a situation that had just become very real, very documented, and very visible. You should go, he said quietly to Natalie. Not a request. Not an order. The words of someone who understood that the only move left was to remove the witness. She didn't move. She stood exactly where she was, her hand steady, her breathing even, her entire body the opposite of everything Whitfield had tried to make her become. The invisible nurse. The disposable one. The person without authority or voice or value. Except none of that had ever been true. Dr. Chen, she said, and her voice had changed. Dropped an octave. Lost every trace of deference and acquired the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I need to review the complete medication record from the past 72 hours. There may be other alterations. And the Federal Protection Officer in this room needs to know that the medication tampering constitutes a security breach under his protective custody status. Dr. Chen blinked once. Then nodded. The board president turned slowly in his chair, his eyes finding Dr. Whitfield against the far wall. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the administrator's face, a face that had orchestrated every cruelty, every carefully calculated humiliation, every strategic move to push out the quiet trauma nurse who asked too many questions about equipment invoices and billing discrepancies. For 6 months, Whitfield had built his empire on the foundation of her silence. Dr. Whitfield, the board president said, his voice dropping to the register of someone delivering a sentence. You understand that when your internal investigation was launched, standard protocol required an automatic federal audit of your department. Whitfield's jaw tightened. His hands moved to his sides, fingers curling. That audit was completed 48 minutes ago, the president continued. Your entire network is compromised. Medical supply kickbacks dating back 7 years. Insurance billing schemes totaling $240,000. Equipment orders flagged repeatedly by junior staff, orders that were ignored, overridden, and buried in departmental files. The compliance officer slid a folder across the table. No one opened it. They didn't need to. The irregularities that Master Chief Hayes questioned 6 months ago were the entry point for the investigation that just destroyed your career, the president said quietly. The one you launched trying to destroy hers. Whitfield's mouth opened. Closed. His voice came out as a whisper, I can explain. You're terminated, effective immediately. Your credentials are flagged with the state licensing board as of 3 p.m. today. Your medical license will be stripped within 72 hours pending review of the federal findings. The room didn't move. Didn't breathe. Whitfield stood there in his tailored suit, his Rolex, his entire identity collapsing in real time, reduced from department chair to a man watching his authority vaporize. Additionally, the president said, the board has been notified that community college instructor positions are typically available for individuals in your situation. Cedar Creek Medical will not contest your employment in educational roles. He paused. Non-clinical ones, obviously. Someone in the observation window let out a small, involuntary sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a gasp. Whitfield heard it. His face flushed crimson, the color spreading down his neck like floodwater. Teaching CPR. At community college. For minimum wage. A man who had controlled cardiac surgeons and intimidated residents, who had wielded institutional power like a blade, reduced to demonstrating chest compressions to teenagers taking a summer class. The humiliation wasn't delivered with cruelty, it was delivered with bureaucratic finality, the kind that leaves no room for appeal or negotiation or the recovery of dignity. Whitfield left the room without another word. His shoes clicked against the tile, growing quieter. The door closed. The board president looked at Admiral Carson, still lying in the hospital bed that had been wheeled into the conference room. The old officer's eyes were clear now, fully present, focused entirely on the point where Natalie stood in the doorway, her scrubs still carrying the faint copper scent of his blood from the emergency that had changed everything. That evening, Natalie stood in Admiral Carson's private room on the 4th floor. The machines around his bed had stabilized into a quiet rhythm, the ventilator exchanging breath, the cardiac monitor tracing steady hills and valleys, the 4-pump delivering medications measured in milliliters and micrograms. Through the window, Portland was sliding into dusk, the rain that had threatened all day finally breaking free, hammering the glass with the sound of applause. She had changed out of her blood-stained scrubs hours ago. A Navy chaplain had brought her clean clothes from somewhere, simple gray slacks and a white shirt that made her feel more exposed than the scrubs ever had. No badge. No name tag. No institutional armor between her skin and the world. Admiral Carson's eyes were closed, but his breathing was deep and natural now, the machine supporting him, not replacing him. The crisis had passed. His body was remembering how to sustain itself. Natalie turned to leave, and that's when she saw them on the small table beside his bed. Her combat boots. The one she'd kept locked in her car for 6 months, the worn leather still holding the dust of Helmand Province, the laces frayed from years of being tied tight enough to cut off circulation in the field. Someone, possibly the Admiral's aide, possibly the Navy General, possibly someone whose name she would never know, had retrieved them from her locker before hospital security had cleared it out that morning. They sat there on the side table, beside a water pitcher and a bouquet of flowers no one had ordered, looking like relics from an archaeological dig. Symbols of something ancient and unburied. Admiral Carson's eyes opened. They found her immediately, as if they'd been searching for her in the dark behind his eyelids. His right hand lifted slowly, still tethered to the fall line, trembling with the effort of even that small movement. The tattoo on his arm caught the overhead light, her name in black ink, carried in his skin for more than a decade, a scar that had never healed because some wounds aren't meant to. "I never forgot your name," he whispered, his voice rough from the breathing tube. "I just couldn't remember your face." Natalie stood in the doorway, the rain hammering the window behind her, and for the first time in 6 months, she allowed her cover to fall away completely. Not dramatically. Not with tears or trembling or the kind of catharsis that needs an audience. Just a gradual settling, the way a soldier removes armor piece by piece after a siege has finally ended. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The Admiral's eyes had already found everything they were looking for. She was no longer the quiet trauma nurse deferring to doctors, accepting insults in silence, maintaining her cover while her dignity was systematically dismantled. She was Sheeton Ron. Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. The woman who had carried him 3 miles through enemy fire. The one who had chosen his life over her own safety, over evacuation, over the luxury of leaving him behind. She stepped into the room and sat on the edge of his bed, careful not to disturb the lines running into his arm. Outside, thunder rolled across the city like distant artillery, the kind of sound that carries its own language, spoken only by those who have heard it before. Her boots sat on the table beside them both, waiting to be claimed again. The board president stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the polished conference room floor like a knife. "The internal investigation you launched triggered an automatic federal audit," he said, each word deliberate, each one a nail in a coffin Dr. Whitfield had built himself. "Standard protocol for any inquiry involving active military intelligence personnel." Whitfield's jaw tightened. His hand moved to loosen his tie, a man suddenly recognizing that the room had shifted, that the air pressure had changed entirely. The compliance officer opened a laptop. 3 supply chain records illuminated the screen. Equipment orders flagged weeks ago by a quiet trauma nurse nobody had bothered to take seriously. Systematic billing fraud, the officer said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. Kickback arrangements with 3 medical supply companies. Deliberate manipulation of patient anticoagulant protocols to extend hospital stays and maximize billing cycles. The board members Whitfield had called, the ones who owed him favors, the ones who'd laughed at his jokes in the cafeteria, stepped back from him. Not violently. Just away. Like recognizing a contagion. Admiral Carson lay in his hospital bed 2 floors above, watching the cardiac monitors trace the rhythm of a life that shouldn't have been saved. Not by a nurse. Not by someone he'd carried 3 miles through enemy fire in a province where the heat made sound travel like a physical thing. The Navy general spoke next. His uniform seemed to take up more space than his body actually occupied. Master Chief Hayes was placed at Cedar Creek Medical by Naval Intelligence to investigate the sale of classified patient information to hostile actors. Admiral Carson was the protected asset. Your interference nearly compromised a federal security operation. The words landed like a verdict. Because they were. Whitfield straightened. His voice came back, thinner now, higher, a man grasping for solid ground. She violated protocol. She performed surgery without authorization. She performed an emergency cricothyrotomy, no, an open-chest cardiac massage, without proper licensing. The CEO cut him off, and her voice carried the weight of institutional authority. She saved Admiral Carson's life using the only method available in a cardiac arrest scenario with pulmonary embolism where surgical intervention was impossible. She employed skills that exceed the training of most surgeons in this building. A pause. The kind of silence where bad decisions echo. Meanwhile, you altered his anticoagulant doses specifically to create the crisis she resolved. You didn't just manipulate her. You tried to kill the patient she was protecting. The evidence appeared on screens. Digital records. Supply chain documentation. Compliance reports filed quietly for months by people who'd been cooperating with federal investigators all along. Every order. Every invoice. every redirect of hospital funds into private accounts tied to shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevada. Security approached Whitfield. Not gently. Not apologetically. Just two officers in grey uniforms, moving with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested this was procedure, that this had happened before, that it would happen again. Within the hour, Cedar Creek Medical terminated Dr. James Whitfield with cause. His medical license was suspended pending state review. The board issued a formal statement. Dr. Whitfield's actions violated patient safety protocols, fiscal responsibility standards, and federal law. The hospital fully cooperates with ongoing investigations. By evening, his professional reputation had collapsed across Portland's medical networks like a building that suddenly lost its structural integrity. The board members who'd taken his calls now denied ever supporting him. The supply companies cut ties immediately, lawyering up before federal charges landed. His attorney advised him to accept whatever employment he could find to avoid criminal prosecution entirely. 1 week later, Dr. James Whitfield stood in a gymnasium at Portland Community College, demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy named Anne. Minimum wage. No benefits. No status. No one in the room knew who he'd been, and that was the cruelest part, not that they knew and despised him, but that they didn't know at all. That evening, Natalie stood in Admiral Carson's room on the cardiac wing. The machines around him beat their steady rhythm, a metronome of survival, of a heart that shouldn't be beating but was. Her combat boots sat beside his bed, the leather worn and cracked from helm and province heat, from miles of sand and blood and decisions made in seconds that carried decades of weight. Carson's eyes tracked to her face. And this time, they held recognition. Not the fractured memory of a man waking from unconsciousness. Clear. Present. Seeing her. His voice came quietly, the kind of voice a man uses when he's pulled something precious from the wreckage and realized how close he came to losing it forever. I never forgot your name. I just couldn't remember your face. But I remembered what you said when you pulled me out. He paused. Not today, Admiral. Not on my watch. Natalie's composure, the mask that had held steady through 6 months of humiliation, through the crisis, through the firing, through the lowest point of her life at 3 in the morning in an empty diner, flickered. Just for a moment. A breath. A slight tightening at the corner of her mouth. Not tears. Not breakdown. Just the briefest acknowledgement that the weight she'd been carrying alone could finally be set down. The Navy general entered, and his presence changed the room's entire gravity. Your mission is complete, Master Chief. The intelligence you gathered led to arrests beyond Whitfield. A network operating across 3 states, selling veteran medical records to hostile intelligence services. Your work dismantled it. She stood straighter. The military bearing came back, automatic as muscle memory. You have options, the general continued. Return to active duty with your previous rank and fallback pay. Accept a position training trauma response teams at Naval Medical Center San Diego. Or, he paused, pursue something else entirely. The hospital board entered next, the CEO leading them. Master Chief Hayes, on behalf of Cedar Creek Medical, we owe you an apology. Not for terminating you, that was Dr. Whitfield's manipulation, but for not protecting you when we should have. We offer you reinstatement. Head trauma nurse. A seat on our medical ethics committee. And a formal commendation in your personnel file. Natalie looked at them. Each face. Processing. Calculating what each offer meant, what each path would cost her. Thank you, she said, each word carefully measured. I'm not returning to Cedar Creek. I'm not returning to active duty. I'm accepting a position with Naval Medical's Trauma Protocols Development Program. Creating standards for veteran care across military hospitals. The board president nodded slowly, understanding that some people weren't meant to be contained in any single institution. Your boots, the general said, gesturing to the leather sitting on Carson's bedside table. We'd like to display them in the trauma center. With your permission. A symbol. of the bridge between your service and your calling here. Natalie picked them up. The weight familiar. The smell of dust and sweat and memory embedded in every fiber. She held them for a moment, really held them, feeling the history, then walked to the trauma center 3 floors below and placed them in a glass display case beside a plaque that read, Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. 3 tours of duty. 47 combat rescues. 1 civilian life saved when it mattered most. June 2024. She stood in front of that case for a long time. Not crying. Not breaking. Just standing. Allowing herself to be seen. Admiral Carson was medically discharged 2 weeks later. The pulmonary embolism had healed. The cardiac trauma had healed. But there were limits to what even a Master Chief could fix in the human body. He accepted a consulting position with naval intelligence, working with field operatives, ensuring that people like Natalie, soldiers carrying 2 identities at once, received the support they deserved. The tattoo on his arm, the one that read Hayes, finally made sense to the people who asked about it. He didn't have to explain anymore. That was its own kind of healing. In the final moment, as dawn broke over Portland in shades of gold and grey, Natalie stood at the window of the cardiac wing. The city sprawled below her, waking up. People driving to jobs they'd chosen. Living lives where no one was watching. Where the masks could come off. She placed her palm against the glass. Cool. Solid. Real. The young nurse from the unit found her there. The one who'd watched the entire spectacle unfold, the humiliation, the crisis, the transformation, the reckoning. "You're leaving?" the nurse asked. Natalie turned. For the first time in 6 months, she didn't lower her eyes. She held the gaze. "Yes." "Will you come back?" She considered the question. The hospital that had tried to break her. The corridors that had carried whispers. The cafeteria where she'd stood in silence while a man in a white coat tried to bury her under his contempt. "No," she said finally. "But I'll make sure what happened here never happens again. To anyone." She extended her hand to shake. The nurse took it, and in that moment, the transformation was complete. The deferential trauma nurse was gone. Standing in front of her was something else entirely, someone who'd walked through fire and emerged on the other side with her integrity intact. "True heroism," Natalie said, "is what you do when the world stops watching." She walked out of Cedar Creek Medical through the main entrance as morning light caught the glass doors. Admiral Carson waited in a wheelchair pushed by the elderly security guard. The staff lined the hallway, the ones who'd stood silent during the humiliation, the ones who'd watched her save a life, the ones who'd learned something about the weight of quiet strength. They applauded. Not loudly, but genuinely. Natalie paused to shake the security guard's hand. He saluted. The gesture of one warrior recognizing another. Outside, the Navy vehicle waited. The general stood beside it, patient as stone. She climbed in, her combat boots on the seat beside her, and the city of Portland disappeared behind her as the vehicle turned toward the highway and everything that came next. If you love a good underdog story, hit that like button now. Subscribe so you never miss one. And comment below, have you ever been the underdog? Let's see how this plays out.